Coming to you now is Lechem Panim with your host, Pastor Cameron Ury, Senior Pastor and Bible Teacher at Renton Park Chapel in Renton, Washington.
Greetings. In our series on the book of Ruth, we have come to the part of the story where Ruth has come under the protection of a man named Boaz, in whose field she has been gleaning. And Naomi is excited about this man, Boaz, because he can, if he wants to, he can redeem both her and Ruth and make them his own, preserving their name and securing provision for them. And so Naomi kind of begins to play the role of matchmaker. It says in verse 1 of Ruth chapter 3 and following, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do.' And she replied, 'All that you say I will do.' And so she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her." Now keep in mind that Ruth had, like every widow before her, gone through a period of mourning over her husband's death, not wearing perfume, but wearing mourning clothes. But now the time of mourning was over, and Naomi tells her, "Wash, anoint, and put on." And so Ruth does. And just imagine being Ruth, wrapping yourself in a cloak and sneaking out of Bethlehem eastwards toward the threshing floor. And she's moving stealthily, trying to hide her face from anyone who might recognize her. And approaching the threshing floor, she enters quietly without making herself known. And Boaz and his men are threshing, and after they're finished, they begin turning in for the night, grabbing some dinner, and then going to bed. And verse 7 says, "And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down." And the reason she lays down at his feet is to demonstrate her dependence on him. You know, I think that most of the men I've come into contact with who are married tend to be taller than their wives. And usually that's helpful, but not always, especially when it comes to how your wife makes the bed, because the end of the bed doesn't really matter too much for your wife. She rarely, if ever, comes into contact with it. However, for tall guys like me, as I quickly discovered after I got married, there's always a danger of my feet sticking out the bottom. And many of you guys know exactly what I mean. You can't sleep like that. You got to have those feet covered. My wife, she'll reserve a little bit of material to tuck under the foot of the bed, but not much. And when I make the bed, I like to get a lot more of that end under there to make sure my feet aren't going to get exposed, especially on one of our wintry nights. Because few things are more uncomfortable than having your feet exposed while you're trying to sleep. And men, if you wake up to exposed feet, what do? You try to bend a little bit to kind of suck those babies back in, and especially on some of the cold nights we've been having lately. But verse 8 says, "At midnight, the man was startled and turned over," and the Hebrew is actually bent forward. And this makes sense. The night is getting colder. His exposed feet are getting more uncomfortable. He's startled. He bends forward. And what does he see? It says, "And behold, a woman lay at his feet." And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant." Now, in the English, we kind of lose what's going on. For us, a servant is a servant. But in Hebrew, there are actually two words for servant. There's amah, and then there's shipka. Now, remember that before, Ruth called herself a servant in chapter 2, verse 13. And she called herself a shipka, which was a slave servant with few rights. And she didn't have to take that title, but she did out of humility and respect. But notice that here, she no longer calls herself shipka. She calls herself Amma, which is a maidservant who could enjoy the privileges of being in an Israelite household and could even give birth to an heir. And so she, like many girls do today, she's dropping her guy a hint. She's saying, hey, I'm no longer Shipka. No, I am Amma. You can claim me. I have that right. Now remember that verse from Ezekiel 16 that says in verse 8, when I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you are at the age for love. And I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. It's a wonderful picture of God entering into a marriage relationship with Israel. But it's interesting, in that culture, every man would wear a prayer shawl called a talith. And the word talith contains two Hebrew words, tal, meaning tent, and ith, meaning little, and thus you have little tent. So each man had his own little tent. 6 million Jews could not fit into the tent of meeting that was set up in the Old Testament, and therefore what was given to them was their own private sanctuary where they could meet with God. They would pull it up over their head and pray and chant privately to God. And so the talith, it became known as their prayer closet. That's right. When Jesus talks about going into your closet to pray, he's not talking about a literal room in your house. He's referring to the Jewish custom of going into your talith to pray secretly, as opposed to those who want to make their identity known while they pray publicly. Now, the talith also has significance for marriage. Jewish weddings are sometimes performed under a prayer shawl or talith held up during the ceremony. And in Mideast culture, they would cast a garment over the person being claimed for marriage. Now in Numbers 15:38, the word translated for the border or corner of the talith is a Hebrew word which can also be translated wings, as it is some 76 times in the biblical text. And for this reason, the corners of the prayer shawl are often called wings. In Ezekiel 16:8, the Lord speaks to Jerusalem and says, I spread my wing over thee and covered thy nakedness. And it's a way of saying that Israel has come under the talith of God, his wings of protection. They share in the intimacy of his face. And so you have all this imagery going on. Now, in light of that, look at what Ruth asks Boaz to do in verse 9 of chapter 3. She says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now remember, Boaz had blessed her, saying in chapter 2, verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Well, here Ruth is bringing up that same terminology, and what I think she's doing is she's dropping her guy another hint. She's saying, Boaz, I want you to be the fulfillment of your blessing to me. I want you to be God's wing of protection over me. And it says in verse 10, and he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And listen to how he gives her assurance. He says, and now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Now that phrase in Hebrew is eshet kayil. It's the same phrase that's used in Proverbs 31:10 of the excellent wife. You see, Boaz is saying that Ruth fits that description, that rare quality of woman. And not only does Boaz see her this way, but Boaz's fellow townsmen also see clearly that she is Eshet Kayil, an excellent woman. And we remember from chapter 2, when Boaz first enters the scene, he is also called worthy. So they share the same qualities and are therefore a good match. But there's a problem. Although Boaz is very moved and reassures her that he'll do all that she asks, he explains in verse 12, saying, and now it's true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. You see, he's concerned about her reputation. He's protecting her. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" And then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Now Boaz, he isn't sending the barley back with Ruth solely for their sustenance. The fact that he gives Ruth such an ample supply, it was to confirm his intentions to Naomi. And even in his saying, "You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law," he's revealing himself to be the channel of the Lord's recompense and kindness to Naomi, as well as to Ruth. He has heard of this new name, Mara, that Naomi has given herself. And he wants to demonstrate to her that God is not done blessing her, that she doesn't have to remain bitter. God is going to make her sweet again. And it says in verse 18, she, Naomi, replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." In other words, Boaz is not going to waste any time. Why? Not just because he wants to help, but he is eager to enter into that marriage relationship with Ruth. And that eagerness, just like the eagerness of every man who is betrothed, is a picture of God's eagerness to enter into a relationship with you and me. Yet sometimes we think of ourselves as Ruth did, as the slave servant, the shipka. But God says, "No, you are nobody's shipka. You are my Amma, for I desire you to dwell in my house, to dwell in my tent, to share in my face, to dwell under the shadow of my wings. I want to envelop you. I sent my son for that very purpose, that in him you might be brought into my family." You know, there's an amazing prophecy of Jesus in Malachi 4, which says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall." The question is, have you received that spiritual healing? Are you living every moment knowing that you dwell under the wings of your Redeemer? If not, you can invite him today. You can say, "Jesus, throw your cloak over me. Lay claim to every area of my life. Take all of who I am, all the sin, all the bitterness that goes with sin, and make me sweet." If that's your prayer this morning, as we close this program today, I want to encourage you to enter into your closet in a spiritual sense. Lift up your heart to him and say, "Jesus, I want your face. I want your presence. I want your life. Throw your wing over me and claim me as your own." And he will. And he will produce in you life. And that life will bear fruit like you can't even imagine. Embrace him today. Amen.
Today's episode of Lechem Panim has been made possible by Renton Park Chapel, a church that is committed to the ministry of sharing the joy of hearing and doing God's Word, and to the mission of bringing people into the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ in and through vibrant preaching, teaching, Bible study, prayer, and ministry to a world that is in desperate need of the healing touch of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry here at Renton Park Chapel, or would like to request any of our messages here on Lechem Panim, you can visit us online at rentonparkchapel.org or lechempanim.org. You can also find us on both Facebook and Twitter. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for listening. And may you know all the fullness of having in your life the bread of the presence of God.